Right. Here we go, letting everybody in.
Okay.
Great. Wow, here we go. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Where are you all from? Where is everybody from? Please feel free to write in the chat box. I'm here with Scott Thornbury. Here he is. Where are you at the moment, Scott?
I'm in a small town just north of Barcelona in Spain, small town on the coast, where it's baking hot and humid, and it's about to rain.
And it's about to rain, okay. So how are things over there with the dreaded, with the C word, the coronavirus?
Well,
right
I mean, you know, Spain was, as you well know, was struck pretty hard. We had a very severe lockdown from which we've emerged. For me personally, I mean, there was pluses and minuses. Since most of my work is I work from home predominantly, and I teach online and do all that. I have been for years. It didn't affect me professionally, except that I lost my job. The university, yes, the university I worked for in Manhattan was hit very badly by the downturn in student numbers, because 40% of their student population comes from overseas. And so they had a kind of what I imagine was a balloon debate, where they decided who can we toss out of a balloon.
Yeah.
And my name, being non-resident and not even American, I was one of the first to be tossed out. So I've been forced into kind of early retirement, but that's okay.
That's fine, no problem. Well, look, I'm just going to share the screen with everybody for a second to say welcome, Scott, and welcome everybody to We're All in This Together, our interview live with Scott Thornbury today, and to say thank you very, very much to International House in Montevideo for sponsoring us and providing the Zoom platform. And any of you who were here over the last couple of sessions, you will know that International House are starting a literary acquisition, the teaching and learning course. In fact, it starts tomorrow, Monday, the 3rd of August. And you can get a 15% discount for mentioning We're All in This Together. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. I just want to say to everybody as well, there we go, that it's a real shame that Florencia can't be here with us today, like she always is. Unfortunately, she had surgery this week and she's still recovering from it. So she wanted everyone to know how sorry she was that she couldn't be here. She really, really wanted to be here with Scott and with everybody else, but she's doing all right. She's doing all right, but she's still recovering. So, well, look, Scott, let's start off, shall we, by talking about the D word, shall we? Because and that D word being dogma. I see the wry smile on your face before I even ask the question, because the situation is you've written about 17 books and countless articles, and you're the series editor for Cambridge Handbooks for Teachers, but you're arguably still most famous for being the father, as it were, of Dogma ELT. Is that a good feeling, or does it get annoying sometimes?
Well, it's nice to be the father of something, I guess. No, it doesn't get annoying. I mean, it's intriguing how what started life as a kind of a dashed off article I wrote in 2000, literally 2 pages long, for the 𝐼𝐴𝐴𝐴 newsletter, kind of propagated this monster, which I've had to live with ever since. And such that it's true, I do get identified with dogma and with Teaching Unplugged, as we tried to kind of rebrand it. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, just let me fill you in on the background. In 2000, I wrote that article where I expressed what I thought was a kind of a concern that we were over-resourced in the profession and we were losing sight of some of the core pedagogical values, particularly those associated with the communicative approach. It was the communicative approach that I, in a sense, grew up with. And I've always subscribed to its basic beliefs that you learn a language principally through communication, or that communication at least should be in the main activity in the classroom. But I saw communication getting squeezed by the pressure of not just technology, which in the year 2000, which is actually relatively light, but by the influence of the course book and everything that the course book kind of encapsulates, particularly the grammar syllabus and the methodology that you learn a language by learning one grammar McNugget at a time. It's kind of incremental, linear, mechanistic process in which the learner has no say in terms of, you know, what they want to talk about. It's all prescripted. And so I use the analogy of the Danish Dogma 95 film movement, which tried to, what they called, mount a rescue operation for filmmaking, to rescue filmmaking from the clutches of big budget, high tech Hollywood movies, and to create movies which were locally produced without special effects, local stories, amateur actors, etc. And I saw an analogy there between what I wanted to mount, which was a rescue action for English language teaching or language teaching generally. And so I wrote that article saying, do we need a similar kind of movement in English language teaching? And it was like a spark that ignited a forest fire. Although I have to say, it took a while to kind of get burning. But when that article went out in March 2000, I immediately started getting people contacting me saying, oh, that's amazing. That's exactly what we've been trying to do in our school in London. Or a teacher in Poland said, no, this is what we want to do here. Is what I've been doing, you know, and somebody in Romania. And so it went on. And so we started a discussion group online, which is something that you could only just do in those days. And that lasted for well 10 years at least, generating a huge amount of discussion, debate, argument, counter-argument, and so on. And out of that emerged actually, can I be shameless and
you can.
A copy, if I can see it. Anyway, the book, oh, here it is. Teaching Unplugged, which I co-wrote with Luke Meddings, who's one of the original subscribers to the group. And that kind of, in a sense, pulled together all this discussion that had been going on for all these years and kind of tried to reduce dogma, or tried to reposition dogma, not as being anti-course book or anti-technology or anti-anything, but pro-communication, pro the learner, yeah? And so we boiled down the basic principles of dogma stroke teaching unplugged to 3, which was language learning.
I'll tell you if you don't remember.
I'm gonna have to look them up. Language, what's the first one?
Emergent language.
Teaching that is conversation driven, materials light, and which focuses on emergent language. That is the language that emerges in the classroom out of the conversations or the texts created by the learners. So it's not a pre-selected syllabus of items. Today is Tuesday, we're going to do the present perfect continuous. Even though we've done it before, or even though you may not be ready for it, or even though you may never use it, we're going to do it because it's in the book, it's in the syllabus, and it's in the exam. So this was a kind of what we were trying to do, this counter movement. So that was the history. Now, 20 years on, I'm thinking, wow, I mean, interestingly enough, actually, I'm working with a group of teachers at the moment in Jordan. These are refugees, the teachers from Syria and Sudan and Somalia, among other countries, they have been having dogma lessons themselves in Jordan, and now they're teaching their fellow refugees using these same techniques, but online, because of the big change. So that what's happened, and so I have a session on Tuesday, a training session on Zoom with these teachers, where we talk about the experience, how it's been going. I can watch some of their lessons, which are recorded on Zoom, and then I give feedback, and we talk about various techniques that we could be using, etc. So this is what's happening now in 2020. Refugees in lockdown are using dogma, or teaching unplugged, principles and practices to teach other refugees. So I think, well, you know, if I'm the father of anything, I'm proud to be the father of that.
Great. Well, in fact, I don't know whether this was what you were just mentioning a second ago, but in one of our email exchanges, you mentioned a course that you're doing in dogmatic teaching at the moment.
Ah, well, yes. So that coincidentally, I have been, I mean, coming back to your original question, I did try to sort of lay the ghost of dogma. I want to say, no, it's not the only thing I've ever done or I want to be known for, but it just keeps coming back. It's like, you know, bamboo. You cut it down and it springs back up again. And so 2 years ago, I was asked to do a course in Russia, an intensive weekend course on teaching dogma, which I did. And actually was extraordinarily pleasurable. And these were a fantastic group of teachers who knew more about dogma than I did, actually, many of them. And then I did the same thing in a similar kind of course in Ukraine. And then I was due to go back in April to Belarus and do the same course in Minsk. But of course, that was cancelled. So I've resurrected the course, and I'm going to do it online now for the ITDI, the International Teacher Development Institute. And Vicky has kindly, hi Vicky.
I'm going to mention you in a second, Vicky.
Has kindly posted the link.
Yes.
And that's running in September over 4 weeks. So it'll be an online course in the principles and practice of dogma / teaching unplugged.
Right.
And Carolina has already signed up. Bless you, Carolina. I'll see you in September.
Oh, great. Which Carolina is that, by the way? You don't know her surname, do you?
Vaskovich.
Okay, great. Okay, no, I was going to mention that, and especially now that Vicky's just written in the chat box, because my involvement with you, Scott, was when I was doing my Delta experimental practice about 10 years ago, and I wrote you an email asking a bit more about dogma and whether you thought it was possible to have a school or, you know, teach a course on a long-term basis. And you said, actually, there's a woman called Vicky Saumel in Buenos Aires, in Núñez, who's already doing it. And then I got in touch with her and I went to observe a couple of her classes. So thank you for that as well, Scott. I've got a lot to thank you for. That's
amazing. That's amazing. And that was the strength of that discussion group that, as I say, went for 10 years. It gathered together some fantastic minds and it disseminated the kind of basic principles of dogma so that they could emerge, which is a dogma principle, locally, adapted to the local context. And that's what Vicky obviously did. And I'm ever so grateful.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So, you know, talking about that, because it's been, well, you've just mentioned the discussion group. A lot of we will talk about methods and approaches a bit later, but a lot of the methods that we learn about, that we use, etc. One of the differences between that and dogma is that dogma seems to have been something, like you mentioned the teachers in Russia, and you said that some of them knew more about dogma than you did, and possibly you're being slightly tongue-in-cheek about that. But on the other hand, it's something that many people have constructed together, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the pleasures of the kind of process of the dogma discussion and everything that followed, the writing of the book, etc., was that the way it synthesized lots of different educational strands, many going back a century to people like John Dewey, for example, the idea of experiential learning, or Paulo Freire in Brazil and the idea of dialogic pedagogy. So in a sense, you know, one of the things that was very clear was that dogma didn't create anything new. What it did was it labeled what was already, in a sense, existing in a lot of teachers' practice. And a lot of teachers have said, oh, dogma, I've been doing that all my, you know, there's nothing new about that. So well, yes, exactly. This is what experienced teachers learn to do. They learn to move away from the constraints of the course book, of the syllabus, of the exams. I mean, they're always there, but they learn to create some space within that, these constraints, to engage the learners by grounding their lessons in the experiences, feelings, you know, fears, hopes, aspirations of the learners, and centering. So there's nothing, so this is what we were doing. It was kind of a natural process that most teachers go through. It's just what we did was we put a kind of name on it. And by putting a name on it, you sort of authenticate it. And so a lot of people say to me, oh, that's so good that you did this, because I mean, I used to do this and I felt ashamed, or I was terrified my director of studies, blah, blah, blah. No, no. And it's interesting that you should mention the Delta, Alistair, because it was the Delta, particularly the experimental practice element, component, or whatever it was of the Delta course, which in the old days when I was a Delta trainer, it was people would do Silent Way or TPR or something like that. And now a vast amount of them do so-called dogma lessons. And one of the great gratifying things about going around the world at conferences, when I used to go around the world, was that people would come up to me and say, yes, I taught a dogma lesson on my Delta course. And I was a bit skeptical at first, but it was fantastic. The students loved it and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, good, I'm pleased.
Yes, good. Well, look, I'm going to say this now. I should have actually said it earlier on. To everybody, there's like nearly 200 people out there. Please feel free. As you know, the idea of we're all in this together is that everybody gets to ask Scott questions, not just myself. So feel free. Anything that occurs to you, please do. So it's dogma is still, I would say, still in a way kind of controversial. I mean, you just mentioned the possibility of someone's director of studies, someone's coordinator saying, hang on a minute, I want you to do things this way rather than doing things this way. I mean, I don't want to get into dodgy territory, but there's a feeling that the idea of dogma is it's anti-technology and it's anti-course book. What would you say about that?
Well, I mean, as I said before, it sort of was in its original inception. It was kind of anti, because I saw course books and grammar syllabuses and everything that course books stood for as standing in the way of what I felt was the real communicative approach. Because if you go back in history, the communicative approach did emerge out of a belief that you learn a language by using it, not you learn a language in order to use it, but you learn a language through using it. So there was that experiential element to it. And those original architects of the communicative approach, like Dick Allwright and Chris Brumford, etc., they were all, that was it. You know, you start off with communication, you start off with a production task, you start off with a student saying something or writing something, and then you give them feedback on that, and then they do it again, and so on and so on and so on. So this was the kind of task-based circle, if you like, cycle. And I saw that as being, the course book stood in the way of that, because they didn't start off with, let's talk about something that you want to talk about. They said, today I'm going to teach you the present perfect continuous because you don't know it and I do. And this way I can assert my authority on you, and then we can test you on it, and you're guaranteed to make mistakes in it. And therefore, again, so it goes on. So, I mean, this is I'm exaggerating, and I'm saying 99% of teachers don't teach like that. But it seems that it was very difficult to find a space to do this real communication when you have this kind of grammar agenda sort of on top of you. You know, oh my God, it's Tuesday, I have to teach the present perfect continuous, otherwise I'll get the sack. So So that was all. So it was controversial because of that, because it dared to challenge the existing hegemony, not just of the course book, but the whole system. And it still does in some ways, because I mean, the system hasn't gone away. If anything, the grammar syllabus has reasserted itself with a vengeance. And so I still see a place for a dogma approach. But of course, I'm a realist too. And I know that in 99% of people's teaching situations, you cannot throw out the course book. You cannot ignore the exams. You cannot create your own syllabus. But you know, we're teachers. We've been very good at this. We adapt. We change little things. When the door is closed, nobody can see us or hear us, and we do little things. And these are the famous dogma moments. And when you talk to teachers and say, you know, what was the best lesson you ever taught? And they'll often say, they won't say, it was when I taught Unit 12 of English File. So they never say that. They'll say, it was one lesson when there was a power cut and we just had to kind of like improvise. And I think JJ was talking about something similar last week. But my first teaching years overseas were in Egypt, and we had power cuts virtually every night. And so you learned to improvise. You couldn't rely on turning on the cassette. Listen to this, you know, and so on. So we had conversations in the dark. And once you've done that once and you realize, oh, this is amazing. Even beginner students can, with a bit of help, you can get a conversation going. And until you've experienced that, of course, you are less liable to take those kinds of risks, which I think of it. That's the other thing about dogma, actually. I mean, you mentioned the Delta course, Alistair, but I think for many teachers who said, well, I can't do this in my daily life, but when I do it as an experiment, I learn an awful lot about myself and my students. So it's a kind of professional development activity, which I would recommend. So just once in a while, just you know, do a lesson without the course book and see what it feels like. Do a lesson where you say to the students, what do you want to talk about today? Get into groups and do it. And I'll give you some feedback and so on. So we've got
a good question along those lines from Lance Mills, and he's asked. He said, "Hi Scott, how do you think the dogma approach works alongside a flipped classroom? So this way the students can cross off all the tenses, etc., while having a dynamic lesson in person."
Yes, no, I mean, I was actually going to mention the flipped classroom later. It was on my list of things if we start talking about how to engage people online. But the idea that they do the spade work before the lesson, the endlessly boring exercises on the present perfect continuous, do that before the lesson. Do it, you know, use English Grammar and Use. Fabulous book for self-study. But then use the classroom for what classrooms are best at, which is putting people in touch with each other and real communication. What's the point of traveling all the way across town if you're going to sit in a room doing exercises from Murphy?
That's a great quote. It sounds like that sounds like a T-shirt slogan, actually, Scott. Do you think? Because at the moment, I mean, we're in a situation. I'm not sure, to my shame, exactly how things are in Barcelona, but here in Argentina, we've been under lockdown since the 20th of March, I think it is. I think there's plenty of people I know from Uruguay in the room, and as I understand it, they're actually, you know, on a staggered basis going back to school tomorrow, like in person. But here we're going to be in lockdown at least until the 16th of August, I think it is. Imagine a situation where, therefore, we've got a teacher who's going into class tomorrow on Zoom, okay? So going into class with the little bunny ears, but they're going into class on Zoom. They've got like 45 students in the classroom. Do you think that would be difficult for them to like have a dogma style class under those circumstances? Because it's a big class and it's online. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it will be difficult for them if they haven't already experienced it in the real classroom. So the challenge is, if you've experienced this in the real class, even if it's only once or twice, how do you transfer those kinds of interactions into an online classroom. And it seems to me that actually you do it quite easily, because, you know, the history of dogma was to bring language learning back to the people in the room. Now, and when we conceived that, it was the people in the physical room, but there's no reason why it can't be the people in the Zoom room and its various breakout rooms. So the same kind of conversations can happen online as they can happen in the classroom. And the flip side of it could be, you know, the grammar work, etc., doing that. And again, as I said, doing it before the lesson or after the lesson or whatever. Coming back to Lance's question, maybe, yeah, ticking things off that you've actually covered that came up. That's a good idea. But if you can create communicative interaction in the classroom. Now, sometimes you have to contrive this, even in real classrooms. That was the whole point of writing this book. It was like, you know, there's hundreds of activities in this book, because teachers need activities, they need recipes, they need plans, they need templates for lessons. And a lot, especially new teachers, but a lot of templates for lessons are inherently dogmatic, because they provide opportunities for learners to be creative with language and be meaningful. So I'm thinking of things like some very basic games, guessing games, where, you know, and it's great where you can do this online, especially if you can show on your phone some features of your environment, because you can say, okay, we're going to take turns. We're going to guess exactly where each person is, and we're going to show them a quick clip of the room that they're in, and then people can ask questions about it, that kind of thing. Or where the teacher, or the dictogloss activity, where the teacher says, I'm going to dictate a tiny little text. Yeah, while I dictate it, don't write, just listen. It's about 100 words long, so you can't remember it, but you'll remember the images it creates. And when I've finished, you're going to go into breakout rooms and see if you can reconstruct the text from memory, and so on. So those are basic dogma techniques, which require zero materials. And then maybe the text, which is about the teacher, can then generate students writing similar texts about themselves. So it's not that it's just sitting around having conversations until you're blue in the face. No, that doesn't work in classrooms, and it doesn't work online necessarily. But interaction is capable online, and where there's interaction, there is dogma. You can put that on your t-shirt.
Put that on your t-shirt. I like it. Okay. Do you think that, I'm going to ask one more question about dogma, I think. Having said that, we weren't really going to talk about that much. We have done. But what if there's a situation, for example, this is slightly playing devil's advocate, where you've got students some students in the class who, be it online or face-to-face, who don't really want to talk, for example. I'm thinking of, I don't know, adult students who've come back and it's 7:30 in the evening and they're tired and they don't really want to have a conversation. Does the conversation have to be a part of it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think one of the mistakes we made was making conversation part of the kind of 3 pillars. And what really should be said, dogma is driven by not conversations, but by texts. Now, texts meaning both written and spoken. So that, you know, there's no reason why you can't have the conversation as a written thing. And of course, on that chat room, that's exactly what it is. It's not a conversation as such. It's written chat. I mean, it's happening in real time. It's like conversation, but it is written. And there's just that little bit of time so you can correct yourself or look things up. But you can institute conversations. And again, one of these kind of template activities we were talking about, show and tell, for example. I mean, who hasn't done show and tell? I remember at primary school in New Zealand, every lesson began with show and tell. And you knew when it was your turn and you came in and you showed something. This is my pet, yeah, photo. His name is blah, 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 blah. And, you know, you prepared for it. I did this recently. I went back to Spanish learning. I went back to school in Spain to brush up my Spanish. And the teacher gave us exactly the same thing. We had to talk about a city that meant something to us. And we had to do a little PowerPoint presentation and be prepared to answer questions from the students. And I talked about my hometown in New Zealand. So I spent all night till 3 in the morning looking up words like boiling mud, geyser, volcano, etc. And then I presented it. It was a fantastic achievement. I felt so good on top of it. And the questions that students are interested, so that was conversation in a sense. Well, it was talk or student-generated text, but it was formalized. A colleague of mine, Neil Forrest, who I did all my teacher training with my Delta courses with in Barcelona, he has this thing of every lesson starts with the students go into groups and they talk about something they've read or seen or heard in the intervening time between the lesson. They talk about it in groups. And then he goes around, he's listening, and he says, oh, that's an interesting story. I remember that one. And then once it's done, he'll say, okay, Montse, tell us your story about how you got robbed on the subway. And off we go. Now, the students know. They don't told the night before, don't forget. They know that because it happens every lesson. It's the beginning of every lesson. It's part of the routine. We're going to go into groups. We're going to talk. So the student who hasn't prepared is going to feel left out. But they'll still get the benefit of hearing the other people's conversations and contribute to that. So it's, you know, and you can do that online. You can do that online in a Zoom room. There's nothing to stop you doing the same thing. You start the lesson by chatting. Now, every teacher starts the lesson by chatting since time immemorial, but they didn't realize that that was the lesson. They thought this was the pre-lesson, but no, dogma says, no, the chat is the lesson. And the best lessons are the ones that were generated by the chat.
Great.
Am I shouting? Am I shouting? Can you?
No, you are. But I love the passion. That's at least 3 T-shirt slogans we've got in the last 10 minutes. I like it. So, I've got a question from Jeremy here. Which method did you find worked when you were learning Spanish?
Well, oh, don't start me. I mean, what didn't work was the course book. We had a course book. It was a very well-written course book. In fact, I know one of the writers. It was beautifully produced. But I was doing an intensive course, 2 weeks, 20 hours a week. We spent the first week on the unit on the course book whose topic was television. Television? I mean, who watches television, for heaven's sake? Certainly not me. I had nothing to say about it. And the other thing is, the grammar in that unit, can you believe it, was, guess what, all you Spanish speakers and Spanish teachers out there, what is it going to be? If it's B2 level in a course book, it's going to be the subjunctive. The subjunctive. I mean, I can't do I still get confused between the preterito and the imperfecto in the indicative. I mean, the subjunctive, that's what I call icing on the cake. But every time I've gone to a language lesson in Spanish, it's always been about the subjunctive. It's like, there's no other grammar in Spanish except the subjunctive? You must be kidding me. But when we got onto the unit on cities, which was the second week, that's when this teacher had the inspiration. We're going to do these presentations. The other thing about those lessons was what I loved, and this is out of respect for the teachers were fantastic at letting us talk and then giving feedback on it. So, and the students were fantastic because we're all kind of adults and we didn't want to talk about television. So we found any excuse to talk about, you know, so one of the students had been down to that silly festival in Spain where they throw tomatoes at each other. So when she came back, talk about the tomato festival. Of course, that's what we talked about. We talked about. And then the teacher gave us feedback and the teachers were fantastic. In fact, one of them was from Argentina. And these women were fantastic. They'd been teaching for 40 years. They knew everything about Spanish grammar, including the subjunctive. So they're able to say, stop everybody. You're still having trouble with ser and estar. I mean, can you believe it? This is B2. And the subjunctive was like the least of our worries. We were still having trouble saying, estoy casado or soy casado. I mean, and then she would say, stop everybody. We're going to have to review this. Estoy muerto or soy muerto. I mean, for me, those lessons were a vindication of everything I'd been saying about dogma, that the course book was rubbish, got in the way, but the teachers were fantastic because they knew their grammar and they were able to generate conversations and give feedback. That's all you needed. That's what I wanted. I wanted correction. I needed to be correct. My Spanish was terrible because my friends never correct me. They wouldn't be my friends if they corrected me. But teachers are allowed to correct. That's why you pay good money. I'm paying you to correct me. Please. Write it down.
Sorry, you've given me the giggles, Scott. Okay, so look, Yeah, no, I do. Jeremy's asked me, do I relate, Alistair? Yes, I totally relate. I must say, and the grammar that I started learning, because when I started learning Spanish when I came out here, the other thing is that many of the things that I was being taught was like, were phrases like, I don't know, phoning a hotel and saying, quisiera hablar con el señor blah, and then, you know, I got out here to Buenos Aires and suddenly people were using the most incredibly colorful language. And I thought, hang on a minute, like you're saying, Scott, this is what I want to do. These are the kind of conversations I want to have. And this is the kind of, you know, I'm going to call it real language that I want to learn. Well, look, Dogme, this is bringing it to methods for a second. Dogme, would you say, I don't want to dwell on this for a particularly long time, but if you had to say if it was method or approach or something else, what would you say?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I've been dealing with that question for so long, and I keep saying it wasn't a method. It was an idea. It was an analogy. It was a metaphor. That was all. It was a suggestion. It just became, and then everybody said, oh, this is Scott Thornbury's method. Oh, this is Scott Thornbury's one big idea. No, I've had two big ideas. It's one of them, but I have another big idea. But then I eventually gave up and said, okay, let's call it a method. Then what attributes of a method does it meet? And a method has to have a theory of learning and a theory of language. And there is a theory of learning in dogma, which is the same theory of learning as in task-based learning, from which, in a sense, it's derived. And there's a theory of language, which came after, really, I think, which is more to do with emergent language constructions, etc. It's not just about grammar, it's about vocabulary, lexical, all those kind of things thrown into the bag. So when I wrote, now here, publicity spot, sorry, but when I wrote this book, which is called 30 Language Teaching Methods, of course I included it because, you know, why not? And, but I do make the point that it didn't start life as me sitting there saying, I'm going to design a method and it's going to make me rich. No, it was not, it didn't happen like that at all, but it does have some of the attributes of a method, certain techniques and procedures, etc. A philosophy, if you like.
Well, look, speaking of which, because I wanted to talk about methods and I want to talk about your new book in a second, that we have landed people on the moon and we're able to print 3D body parts now. Why is it that we can't find a definitive method for learning another language, do you think? Or can we?
Yes, there is one.
Oh. There is
one, and it's not dogma. If you took and we're talking about adults here, because children up to a certain age will learn the language anyway, whatever you do, whatever method. But if they get enough exposure, and I suppose that's the point I'm making, with an adult like me, for me to have learned Spanish, age 36 or whatever, when I came to Spain, I would need to have been airdropped into a Spanish village where nobody spoke English. Mm. That is to say, I would need to have experienced total immersion. And anybody who experiences total immersion learns the language, even as an adult. Mm. So that's the method that works. But of course, you know, we can't replicate that 3 hours a week in a classroom. No. We can replicate some of the experience of that immersion in the classroom, though, by not banging on about the bloody present perfect continuous all the time, but doing immersive kind of communicative experiences and tasks, etc. And then doing stuff outside the classroom and training the learners to take advantage of the affordances that exist outside the classroom, particularly on the internet, to listen, watch, read, etc., have that immersive experience. Now, I'm not saying that grammar doesn't enter into this. I mean, of course it does, but the grammar in a sense is late acquired. It comes afterwards, after the experience of communicating. And then you sit down and say, now, how could I do this better? I know, I need to learn the subjunctive, for heaven's sake, maybe. If I want to be accepted in this village that I've been airdropped into.
I'm trying to imagine a village, sorry, I'm trying to imagine a village where they won't accept you if you don't know the subjunctive.
So coming back to your question, though, to be serious, yeah, there's been lots of different methods because there's lots of different contexts in which languages are taught, lots of different kinds of learners, lots of different theories of learning, lots of different theories of language. It's true. But also in the end, you'll never be able, unless they have this immersive experience, you'll never be able to teach anybody a second language, because it's like trying to train a 50-year-old to run a marathon. You're not equipped for it. Physically, mentally, you know, it's too late. It's a terrible thing to have to say to the learners when they come into your class, like, it's too late. But you'll never be able to run a marathon, but you'll be able to walk 10 miles. I mean, you know, as a language teacher, I can give you the means whereby you will never be mistaken for a native speaker, but you will be communicatively efficient in the kind of context which you need to be. And that, again, is the principle of the dogma approach. You teach what students need and what they want, and you engage with them, and so that they become part of the process of negotiating the syllabus, so that they get what they want, and they're not taught the subjunctive. And if I'd said to my Spanish teachers, like, I'll do any course in the curriculum here, but do not teach me the subjunctive, because it's not of any interest or use to me.
Well, I'm going to play slightly devil's advocate now about methods, because you've got the book that you've shown us. Is it really important as a new teacher? Is it really important that I learn about grammar translation, audiolingualism, etc.? I mean, haven't we come too far to need to look back?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and I think I would have agreed with you a few years ago, and I think there's enough books out there about methods already. We don't need another one. There's some very good ones, and I consulted them and I acknowledged them. But I think actually, two things. One is that as in any profession, it's important to know, to be a professional, it's important to know the history of the profession, to dig down the archaeology of English language teaching. I think it's just interesting, and it's worth knowing. Not least because of how much goes around and around. You know, we think, oh, the natural approach, 1970s, what's his name? Tracy Terrell, Dr. Krashen, yes. But there was a natural approach in 1890. Hello, Dr. Krashen. You know, it's not new. Dr. Krashen would agree. He'd say, yeah, I just labeled it like, But so it's worth knowing that, you know, what goes around comes around, for a start. There's nothing new under the sun. And the other thing is, I think for new teachers particularly, they do need models. They do need a template into which to squeeze some kind of lesson plan. And methods offer that. They say this is, so one of the things about the book, I look at 30 methods, and each chapter is divided, the background, does it work? Oh no, how does it work? Does it work? And then what's in it for us? What's in it for us now as practicing teachers? What could we retrieve from this method? And there's something always to be retrieved from any method. Somewhere, for someone, it probably worked. So it's worth looking at that and saying, this method is pretty. Grammar translation, don't knock it. I mean, millions of people have learned languages over countless centuries through grammar translation. I mean, it serves them very well. I think it needs an update or an upgrade, and that could easily be done to map onto it some features of the communicative approach, but that's not rocket science. But grammar translation, you know, what's wrong with translation? Hello, you can quote me.
Okay, it's a fourth or a fifth t-shirt slogan. At the moment, there's, speaking of methods, there's quite a lot of, there's one in particular that I keep seeing, I don't know if the rest of you out there have seen it, on YouTube at the moment. There's this advert always flashes up with this individual promising to be able to learn a language in 3 months because they were able to learn another language very quickly as well. See, I'm being very standoffish about who this is, but it's like promising you can learn this language in 3 months with this technique. Why do things like that? In fact, Jeremy's asked this question. What do you think about the ads online that claim to have a miracle course and the key to learning the language as an adult?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very interesting phenomenon, actually, and it's kind of an internet phenomenon, although there have been people around for many years. There was a guy called Michel Thomas, for example, in the 1980s, 90s, who taught people like Emma, the actress.
Watson?
No.
Thompson.
Thompson, exactly. And
Yeah.
and Woody Allen, and very other people who rave about his technique. But he was he was teaching how he had learned. He was a polyglot. He had learned hundreds of languages. Now that is now much more common on the internet. In fact, actually in this book, I devote a chapter to what I call online polyglots, because I think, you know, these people are, not all of them are fraudsters or, you know, snake oil salesmen. They actually are worth listening to. I think some of them, and they are phenomenal. If you take, even on their own evidence, they, not just the number of languages they've learned as adults, but the degree of proficiency they claim to have in them. And it's quite impressive and enviable. And I think it's worth, and people are now, even in the literature you get in academic magazines, people are looking, journals are looking at these people now and saying, actually, this is interesting. We may be gifted learners. We need to look at and see what it is that they have and that we could possibly learn from and import into our own learning as learners or our teaching as teachers. So I don't think they should be dismissed entirely. One of the problems, though, is when they kind of, they dine out on their own success, but they don't investigate from an academic point of view. And very few of them reference any of the literature on attitude, aptitude, comprehensible input, fluency. They don't know anything about it. And I think, well, that's, you know, it wouldn't cost you a lot to read a basic book on second language acquisition and then map your own experience into this kind of vocabulary. And that would give them a lot more authority than they have at the moment.
Right. Well, methods aside for a second, what do you think would be the most useful way of teaching and engaging students at the moment in our coronavirus situation?
Well, I mean, I was asked this recently on a webinar thing. Somebody said, how would you engage 30 12-year-olds on Zoom? And I said, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be a millionaire. I mean, you can't actually, I'm sorry. You just have to wait to the day that we go back to real classrooms. We'll come back to that point in a minute. You can engage people more than perhaps, and I think we've already answered in some ways the question a bit by, we say, flipping the classroom, doing some of the kind of boring stuff before or after. Don't use the classroom to do boring Murphy kind of exercises, and there's no fun in that. There's nothing engaging about that unless you maybe turn it into a competition. But even then, that's a kind of shallow kind of engagement, it seems to me. I think you engage people by doing things where they actually are being creative and communicative. I mean, I've been working, here's another bit of background. I've been working for 5 years now, I think, with Nick Bilborough of the Hands Up Project. Where now Nick is an inspired educator who I first got to know because I was editing some books he wrote for the Cambridge Handbook series. And he's an experienced actor and storyteller. And he started this project working with kids, classrooms in Gaza, in occupied Gaza, kids who have no access to native speakers of English or any speakers of English apart from their teacher. And using very simple technology, he's been doing this online since before COVID by 10 years practically, using simple technology, doing stuff with these kids in these classrooms in Gaza, drama activities, storytelling, communicative games. So there's Nick in his kitchen in Torquay in southern England, and he's doing a game with these kids. And the teacher, the classroom teacher, is there in the classroom in Gaza, and these teachers and these kids are playing this game with them, or they're doing plays. Now, of course, these are in classrooms. It's complicated further now because the children are not in classrooms any longer. They're in their homes with poor internet access, but it's still going on. And Nick's been running a very successful Saturday morning sessions with kids games, communicative activities, storytelling with volunteers, hands up project, write it down. I mean, it's the most wonderful thing. It's been engaging kids online for the last 5-10 years. And, you know, through drama, storytelling, games. So it's not and big groups of kids too. So thank you, Vicky.
Project. Do you think students should learn through games as well? It's perfectly yeah.
I mean, you know, kids, games, songs, theatre. I mean, there's nothing else that they need to learn a language.
That's another T-shirt slogan right there. That's another T-shirt slogan right there.
Here first.
Yeah. Let's talk about for a minute. You mentioned storytelling a couple of times, and it seems to me that in terms of engagement, I remember watching a talk, and somebody, I can't remember who it was, unfortunately, but someone had come up with a criticism, I'm going to call it, or a point about dogme, saying something like, but what if like I mentioned to you earlier on, what if there's people in the classroom who don't want to talk? And I remember I sent a tweet at the time, it was a while ago now, to Luke Meddings about it. And he said, if you find the human being in the classroom, you will find someone who wants to converse, who wants to tell a story, it was that he said. So, because you've mentioned storytelling now, so you think that's a really good way of engaging the students?
Yes, I mean, tell your story first. It doesn't have to be like, you know, War and Peace. It doesn't have to be Ernest Hemingway. It's just something that happened to you the other day on the subway. Tell it, have them ask questions, have them guess the ending or the outcome. Then have them go into the breakout room, retell it, write it down. They can stop and send me questions if they get lost. Then they hear it again, maybe, but a different version of it. So you're going to hear the same story again, but I've changed 3 key pieces of information. Anything like I'm inventing, you know, but I mean, this is, and then they do the same on each other. I'm going to tell you a story, then I'm going to tell it to you again, but there's going to be 3 things I've changed in it. You have to listen. So it gives the listener something to listen for.
Yeah.
Now they can do that to the whole class, or they can go into pairs in the breakout room and do it to each other. But I mean, it's not rocket science. Again, there's no materials. They don't have to read anything. And you say, oh, where's the grammar coming from? Well, the grammar is coming from, I mean, it's a well-known fact. Where's the book? I have a new book here somewhere. Task repetition. I was banging on about it at a webinar recently. Some of you might have been at. But when you repeat a task, it's better, always. When you repeat a task in a second language, it's always better. It's more fluent, it's more accurate, and the language gets more complex. And this has been proven again and again in the research. Repeat the task, repeat the task. Now, if you want to guarantee that it gets better, give feedback. Remember my story about my city, telling my story about my hometown in Spanish? It was a fantastic experience. The students were engaged. But what I didn't do, and what this teacher didn't give me the permission to do, was to do it again. And I was desperate to do it again. I said, okay, you've given me the feedback. I want to do it again. I want to do it again. I want to show that I can do it a little bit better this time, taking into account the feedback. That's where the input comes in. It's not because today we're going to do the present perfect continuous and you've got to tell a story using the present perfect continuous 3 times. No, that's not engaged.
We're getting the definite feeling that you're not a fan of the subjunctive in Spanish nor the present perfect continuous. That's abundantly clear from this interview. Listen, Katya has just made a point in the chat box that I'm going to literally quote what she's written here, but you can't do it every day. They lose interest after some time. Discuss.
Well, yeah, I mean, students lose interest in everything. I mean, and this is one of the points of writing the book. The Teaching Unplugged book was to provide a range of activities which was nevertheless consistent with those 3 basic principles. So you could do different kinds of activities, and it doesn't need to be speaking always, it could be writing, and it doesn't need to be in pairs or groups, it could be individual, and you know, and I mean, there's all sorts of possible permutations of some of these basic techniques, I think, that could provide variety. And, you know, when push comes to shove, you know, it wouldn't kill them if you taught the present perfect continuous for one lesson. Nobody's going to die.
No one's going to die. Quite, yeah, quite. So one of the things, going back to Teaching Unplugged for a second, in that case, one of the things that you were just saying, so in terms of our three pillars, as it were, we've got our materials light, emergent language, and maybe conversation driven, but like you were saying, perhaps that should be not text driven, but what were you saying about texts and that particular pillar?
Yes, I mean, instead of just change the word conversation for text, but text meaning both spoken and written. Yeah,
right.
So there's no reason why people say, "Oh, you can't learn to write using dogma." Well, of course, if it's conversation driven, no. Yeah, that was our mistake. Naughty. Right. We should have said text from the start. So students can write their own text. I had this fabulous activity that a colleague of mine taught me, the paper conversations. I think it's in here somewhere. The students, again, it's the formalizing the classroom chat, the chat at the beginning of the lesson. So instead of chatting with your partner about what you did in the weekend, write the chat as if you were texting, yeah? But writing on a piece of paper. Give the paper, yeah. So what did you do in the weekend, Pedro? Pedro writes the answer. What did you do? Blah, blah, blah. Conversations, written down. Written down, fantastic, because the teacher can take it, and there's data here the teacher can use for feedback. So that's writing, yeah? So it's not conversation as such, but and there's language. You see, one of the basic principles, I mean, one of the techniques or methods, coming back to the methods that always interested me was community language learning, not communicative, but community or counseling language learning. One of these kind of fringe methodologies of the 1960s and 1970s, where students in groups having kind of encounters with each other in groups and constructing conversations, which they then record line by line. And then with the teacher's help, there's the teacher's mediating. Whenever the student needs to say something and they don't know how to say it, the teacher tells them, they practice it, it's recorded, etc. The conversation is built incrementally, and then it's played back, and then it's transcribed. This is the bit I like. So this conversation that's generated by the students, their conversation, 100 por 100, is then transcribed, and the teacher points out features of it that seem to be probably within their current level of competence. Prepositions, subjunctive, present perfect continuous, whatever.
Great. Well, you've heard it here first, everyone. There's a new modification to the 3 pillars of dogma. You heard it here first on We're All in This Together. Okay, so I've got 3 questions that we normally ask everyone to kind of wrap things up. And certainly not that I want to, but if you had to finish this sentence, Scott, my secret to motivating students is ... What would you say?
Oh, you didn't ask me about this one before we...
No, I know I didn't. Sorry.
You've thrust this upon me. Well, I would say my secret of motivating students, I don't want to get all kind of cheesy and say it's all about, you know, being a nice guy, all that kind of thing, because I don't think it necessarily is. I mean, obviously, there's the interpersonal relationships you have with your students is very, very important. But I wouldn't want to think it boiled down to that entirely. But I think it's like in any educational context, the secret of motivating them is giving them what they want. Now, you could say, oh, my students don't know what they want. That's why we have a syllabus and a course book. Say, well, actually, did you ever ask them? Maybe you could just put the question and they say, oh, I don't know why I want to learn English. Well, that's okay, fine. Well, I'll teach you the present perfect continuous. But if they do say, I want to travel, I want to work, I want to watch streaming series on television, I want to understand pop songs, then okay, good. Now we have a motive. Once you've got a motive, you've got motivation.
I like that. Once you've got a motive, you've got motivation. Well, think all these T-shirts. We're going to become millionaires with all these T-shirt slogans. Fantastic. Scott, how do you think society will view teachers after coronavirus, after COVID-19?
Well, I mean, I hope they review them as being like they view the health workers as being people who have maintained civilization as we know it. And they
Wow.
deserve to be put on a statue in Trafalgar Square or whatever, because these people have kept things going, even though they've done it under extraordinarily difficult situations. But then teachers have always been resilient. They've had to be. They've had to cope. They've had to be flexible, and they're underappreciated. But they learn to live with that. They're underpaid, and they just about learn to live with that. But what I do hope, well, my biggest fear out of all this is that institutions and ministries will use COVID as an excuse to close down real old-fashioned classrooms and say, oh, we can do it online. Look how successful it's been. But this is my point. This is my answer to the teacher who said, how can I engage 30, 12-year-olds online? You can't, darling. You can't. You can do it in the classroom, but you'll never be able to do it successfully online. That's what classrooms are good for. Don't let anybody close down the classrooms, the real classrooms. And they're trying to do this in universities, for example, all around the world. That's why I lost my job. Don't let it happen to primary school children, particularly. We must have classrooms, real classrooms and real teachers in them.
Wonderful. Okay, well, so, Marcela, I think I've lost her name in the chat box. I think it was Marcela 𝐒𝐿𝐴 has mentioned that she saw you in Mar del Plata, here in Argentina. And in fact, you and I were talking about this a minute ago, weren't we?
Yes. Can I share my screen?
Please, that's what I was going to ask. Please share your screen. Special surprise for you, Marcela.
That's fantastic. This is a photo of my first trip to the Southern Cone in 1995. You can tell by the trousers that I was a kind of fashion victim even then. At Mar del Plata, exactly. My first trip to Argentina, my biggest audience, I'd never spoken with a microphone before. It was fantastic. I loved it. And you know why I particularly liked it? Because it was the first Spanish-speaking country I had visited, having been living in Spain. So it was kind of like, oh my God, I can use Spanish all around the world. Oh, how fabulous. And it was such a wonderful Spanish too. So, so that was my first trip to the Southern Cone. I was in Montevideo more recently, in fact, only 2 years ago, I think. But the last time I was in Argentina was in 2001, and it was for the 25th anniversary of International House, Buenos Aires.
Wow. Yes, I was there. We were there, weren't we, friends? Yeah. We were there. Great. So I'm going to finish with one question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to teachers these days who are very, very tired with all this and everything, what would it be?
Well, I'm tempted to use the advice from Midsummer Night's Dream that the director of the players said to the group after they'd been rehearsing and they'd finished the rehearsal, and she said, or he said, I can't remember, take pains, be perfect, adieu. And I think, you know, as teachers, we do take pains. And one of the things that sort of bothers me is when people say, oh, dogma, that's just about like, you know, not planning. That's just, you know, winging it. I say, no, actually not. It's very hard work doing a lesson where you're building on what the students are giving you. You need to take pains and you need to be perfect. And we all achieve perfection in our own particular way, in our own particular contexts. So that's my Shakespearean advice to you all. Take pains.
Great, fantastic, love it. Well, it's past the hour now, so very, very unfortunately, we're all going to have to say goodbye. I'm going to go on gallery view so that everyone can give you a little round of applause. Thank you very, very much for being with us today, Scott. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm going to say thank you again to International House Montevideo for sponsoring and providing the platform for us. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you again, Scott Thornbury. I've been a fan of your work since I started teacher training, so it's a real pleasure and a privilege to have you here today. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Alistair. Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone. See you next time. Bye.